The morning bells echoed across the valley as the first rays of sunlight touched the stone walls of the convent. Hidden among forests and rolling hills, the monastery had stood peacefully for generations. Inside, Christian nuns followed a routine that rarely changed. They woke before dawn for prayer, tended gardens, copied religious manuscripts, and cared for the sick and poor from nearby villages. Their lives were simple, devoted to faith, and largely untouched by the conflicts that often shook the world beyond their walls. For many of the women, the convent represented safety. Some had entered as young girls, seeking a life dedicated to God. Others had fled difficult circumstances and found comfort within the sisterhood. Together they formed a close-knit community bound by prayer, discipline, and shared purpose. The thick stone walls surrounding the convent seemed eternal, protecting them from danger and uncertainty. Yet troubling rumors had begun to reach even these secluded places. Merchants, travelers, and refugees arrived with stories of war spreading across the Balkans. They spoke of the rapidly expanding Ottoman Empire, whose armies had already conquered vast territories. Towns that once felt secure had fallen. Noble families fled their homes. Churches and monasteries found themselves increasingly exposed as the frontier of conflict moved ever closer. The nuns listened carefully whenever visitors shared news from distant regions. Some reports sounded unbelievable, while others carried enough detail to inspire genuine fear. Villagers whispered about armies numbering in the tens of thousands, advancing steadily through Christian lands. Refugees described smoke rising from conquered settlements and families separated by war. Despite these warnings, daily life continued. The sisters prayed for peace and trusted in divine protection. Many believed that their religious status would shield them from harm. After all, they possessed no weapons, commanded no armies, and posed no threat to anyone. But beyond the mountains, powerful forces were reshaping the world. The quiet peace that had defined the convent for generations was beginning to unravel, and the women inside had no idea how dramatically their lives were about to change. The fear that had once existed only in rumors became terrifying reality when Ottoman forces finally entered the region. The distant reports of conquest were no longer stories carried by travelers. Now the sounds of war could be heard nearby. Marching soldiers, clashing steel, and the cries of frightened villagers fleeing toward any place they believed might offer protection. For many Christian communities, the convents and monasteries became final refuges as the world around them collapsed. Inside the convent, the nuns gathered in prayer as news arrived that neighboring settlements had fallen. Some sisters climbed towers and walls to look toward the horizon, where columns of smoke rose into the sky. The sight confirmed their worst fears. The conflict they had hoped would pass them by was now at their doorstep. As Ottoman troops advanced through the countryside, many religious buildings were caught in the chaos of conquest. Some monasteries surrendered peacefully, while others found themselves looted by soldiers searching for valuables. Sacred objects accumulated over centuries. Golden chalices, silver crosses, illuminated manuscripts, and treasured relics became targets for seizure. What had once been symbols of faith were suddenly viewed as spoils of war. Panic spread through the convent. Some nuns hid precious religious items in secret chambers beneath the building. Others gathered in the chapel, praying desperately for deliverance. A few hoped the soldiers would respect their status as women of religion. Yet as armed men entered the grounds, those hopes quickly faded. Doors were broken open. Storerooms were searched. The peaceful silence that had defined convent life was shattered by shouting and confusion. Sisters who had spent decades together clung to one another as strangers flooded the sacred halls they called home. For many nuns, the most terrifying realization was that they would not be killed immediately. Instead, they were taken alive. Forced from the only life they had ever known, they watched flames and destruction consume their sanctuary behind them. In a single day, their home, security, and future disappeared, replaced by fear and uncertainty about what awaited them next. The capture was only the beginning of their ordeal. Once removed from their convents, many nuns were forced to join long columns of prisoners being marched away from their homelands. Surrounded by armed guards, they traveled across unfamiliar roads through mountains, forests, and vast stretches of countryside that seemed to have no end. Every step carried them farther from the world they had known and deeper into an uncertain future. The journey was exhausting. Many captives had spent their lives within convent walls and were unprepared for weeks or even months of travel under harsh conditions. Food was often limited, clean water was scarce, and exposure to the elements became a constant struggle. During hot days, the sun beat down relentlessly. At night, cold winds swept across the camps where prisoners rested under guard. Perhaps even more painful than the physical hardship was the emotional devastation. The sisters who had lived, prayed, and worked together for years were frequently separated. Friends who had shared every aspect of convent life suddenly vanished into different groups of captives. Some women never saw their companions again. The bonds that had defined their lives were broken without warning. As they moved farther from Christian territories, familiar languages became less common. The churches, villages, and customs they recognized disappeared behind them. Many captives felt as though they were watching their identities slowly fade with every mile traveled. Some clutched small crosses or hidden religious items as reminders of who they had been. Others quietly whispered prayers, seeking strength to endure the uncertainty ahead. Rumors spread among the prisoners about what awaited them. Some spoke of slave markets in distant cities. Others feared they would be sold into households far from anyone who shared their faith or language. No one knew exactly what their fate would be, and that uncertainty created constant anxiety. For these women, the march was more than a physical journey. It marked the painful transition from a life of devotion and stability to one defined by captivity, separation, and fear. The convents they had once called home now felt impossibly distant, almost like memories from another lifetime. After weeks or months of travel, many of the captives finally arrived in large Ottoman cities bustling with merchants, soldiers, and traders from across the empire. The sights and sounds were overwhelming. Crowded streets, unfamiliar languages, and massive marketplaces surrounded the women who had once lived quiet lives behind convent walls. For many nuns, this was the moment when the full reality of their situation became impossible to deny. The captives were no longer viewed as religious women or members of a sacred community. Instead, they were treated as commodities within a system that regarded human beings as valuable property. Potential buyers examined groups of prisoners, assessing their age, health, appearance, and abilities. Negotiations took place over prices, while the captives stood helplessly nearby, unable to influence decisions that would determine the rest of their lives. For former nuns, the humiliation was profound. Only months earlier, they had devoted themselves to prayer, service, and spiritual discipline. They had been respected within their communities and trusted by those who sought guidance or charity. Now strangers discussed their worth as though they were livestock or merchandise. The contrast was devastating. One by one, many women were separated and sold. Some were purchased by wealthy households in major cities, where they would perform domestic labor. Others were sent to distant provinces scattered across the empire. Sisters who had survived the hardships of capture and the long march together were often divided permanently at these markets. Tearful farewells became common as groups that had endured so much together were broken apart. The uncertainty was perhaps the cruelest aspect of all. Once sold, a woman could not know what kind of treatment awaited her. Some owners were less harsh than others, while some captives endured difficult and oppressive conditions. Everything depended on circumstances entirely beyond their control. For many former nuns, the marketplace represented the complete destruction of the life they had once known. Their freedom was gone, their future belonged to others, and the identity they had spent years building seemed to disappear with every transaction. In that moment, many felt they had lost not only their homes, but also themselves. As the years passed, many of the captured women discovered that the greatest challenge was not merely physical labor or the loss of freedom. It was the slow and painful struggle to preserve their sense of identity. Far from their homelands and separated from the communities that had shaped them, they faced constant pressure to adapt to a completely different world. Every day brought reminders that the lives they once knew were gone. The familiar sounds of church bells were replaced by new customs and routines. The languages spoken around them were often foreign. The traditions that had guided their lives since childhood seemed increasingly distant. Some women found themselves in households where no one understood their background or cared about the vows they had once taken. Many former nuns desperately tried to hold on to their faith and memories. In quiet moments, they recited prayers they had learned years earlier within the safety of their convents. Some secretly traced the sign of the cross when no one was watching. Others struggled to remember hymns, scripture passages, and religious teachings, fearing that even these precious memories might eventually fade away. The passage of time made everything more difficult. Months turned into years and years into decades. News from home rarely reached them. They did not know whether their families were alive, whether their convents still stood, or whether anyone remembered them at all. The uncertainty created a deep sense of isolation that many carried throughout their lives. Some captives gradually adapted to their new circumstances, learning new languages and customs simply to survive. Others resisted as much as they could, clinging to fragments of their former identity. Yet even for the strongest among them, the constant separation from everything familiar took a heavy emotional toll. For many women, captivity became a slow process of erasure. Their names, routines, relationships, and even memories of home grew more distant with each passing year. While they remained physically alive, the world that had once defined them seemed to vanish piece by piece. It was this gradual loss of self that many considered the deepest wound of all, a suffering that lingered long after the moment of capture had passed. Centuries later, the stories of these women remain largely hidden in the shadows of history. Great empires are often remembered through their battles, rulers, and military victories, while the experiences of ordinary people fade from memory. The captured Christian nuns were among those whose voices were rarely recorded, leaving historians to piece together their experiences from scattered documents, letters, chronicles, and eyewitness accounts. The rise of the Ottoman Empire transformed vast regions of Europe, Asia, and the Middle East, reshaping political borders and changing countless lives. For many communities, conquest meant adapting to a new reality. Yet for the nuns taken from their convents, the consequences were deeply personal. Their suffering was measured not in lost battles or fallen kingdoms, but in broken friendships, stolen years, and vanished identities. Some women disappeared entirely from historical records after their capture. Their names, once carefully written in monastery documents, simply stopped appearing. No one knows what became of many of them. Others may have spent the rest of their lives in distant cities, carrying memories of their former homes until the day they died. A few undoubtedly found ways to rebuild their lives despite unimaginable hardship, demonstrating remarkable resilience in circumstances beyond their control. Today, the ruins of old churches, monasteries, and convents still stand in parts of southeastern Europe. Weathered by time, they serve as silent reminders of an era marked by conflict and upheaval. Visitors who walk among these ancient stones often see only historical landmarks, unaware of the personal tragedies connected to them. The story of these nuns is not merely about war or empire. It is about human beings caught in forces far larger than themselves. Their experiences remind us that history is more than a record of kings and generals. It is also the story of individuals whose lives were forever altered by events they could not control. Though centuries have passed, their ordeal remains a powerful reminder of the hidden costs of conquest. Behind every empire's expansion were countless forgotten people whose suffering rarely found a place in official histories, yet whose experiences deserve to be remembered.